Hello, everyone, and welcome with a conversation with a dear friend of mine. We're going to talk and deep dive on a few topics that have been in the news lately. But this is Amy Forsyth, and we are going to have a conversation that matters. It's important to veterans, military veterans, but Americans as well. And you won't forget. And we're going to talk a lot about how life imitates art. You really wouldn't believe it unless you heard his story and the emotional roller coaster over the past few years. It's a calling for our guest, a dear friend of mine, retired Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Marine Corps retired, infantry officer, Harvard MBA, and someone who has absolutely found his calling in helping our warriors. So I would like to welcome now at this time, David Gurfein. His friends call him Bull. And welcome to Amy on the X. It's our first edition, and I really couldn't be more thrilled to have you join us tonight. It's been wonderful to watch you through the years, but we go back many years. But I'd like you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about your background and then how you came to be the CEO of United American Patriots, an advocacy group formed to help our warriors in need. So welcome.
Awesome. Hey, thank you so much, Amy. It's always great to reconnect. And you're right. We go back at least 30 years or more from Guantanamo Bay, back when I was a company commander down there. And I think that was your first assignment as a junior Marine right of Paris Island. And, I think we probably did our first interview back then, right when I joined the base. So, yeah, always great. And to reconnect in multiple combat zones ever since. Totally awesome. I don't know any Marine who's probably served in more combat zones than you. So, it's great to reconnect all the time. And yeah, it's been a wild ride. Love being a Marine, enlisted when I was 17, and couldn't believe you got paid to be a Marine. I thought that was the coolest thing ever. And ended up going down to Paris Island myself, and after a while got picked up in an officer commissioning program, and told my gunny at the time I had no desire to be an officer. I told him I wanted to be a sergeant, and he was like, "Son, you're too dumb to be an NCO. We got to make you an officer." And true story, I ended up getting picked up, and I think his intent was to have me go through OCS and then have the Marine Corps just kick me out. But I survived, made it through OCS, and actually did really well there. Loved it. I was an honor graduate out of OCS, went on to get commissioned as an officer in the Marine Corps, graduated from Syracuse University, and just had a great run. 25 years serving in just about every environment you can imagine. Served down the jungles of Panama in the lead up to Operation Just Cause. Led Marines in the deserts of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait during Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm. And then later on, was down in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, multiple tours over to Korea, and then out to Afghanistan early on in 2002, and then with the lead Marines into Iraq in 2003, along with a bunch of other different ops down to Africa and all over the place. So just absolutely great run for the money. Loved every minute of it. And it was an honor to serve with amazing people that fortunately I stay in touch with them. And just yesterday had a corporal that I served with in 1st Battalion, 6th Marines, just reconnected on Facebook. He's actually a fire chief out here in Fairfax County where I live, and looking forward to seeing him in person. And again, he's another Marine that I haven't seen in about 40 years. So yeah, just some of the greatest people in the world to ever meet with and associate with. So to your question of, then coming over to United American Patriots, we could talk about, how long it took me to get on board, but right now, I just continue to serve as best I can, fighting for the rights of these amazing individuals, fellow warriors who chose to step up, who swore an oath, voluntarily swore an oath to support and defend our Constitution, and willingly went in harm's way on our behalf, and got caught up. Sometimes they did some things were wrong, sometimes not necessarily. But either way, we've seen time and again where their rights have been violated. We've seen unlawful command influence to pressure outcomes in a negative way against the individuals. We've seen what's called prosecutorial misconduct. This is where the prosecutors, instead of trying to find the truth, are forcing a narrative to try and make sure that they get a conviction. We've seen investigator abuse, where investigators are pressing to conspire with the prosecutors to form a narrative as opposed to, again, seeking out the truth. And being able to come in here and to fight those battles for these individuals, ordinarily they would get caught up in a system to where it's lopsided. And the only way to really fight that is to make sure that there's awareness going out to the general public. The general public's communicating with their elected representatives, and we're raising funds for them to get the best possible legal defense so that they can actually make sure that the truth comes out. And so it's one of those things. I thought it was just going to be a quick part-time gig, and it's turned into a long-term commitment, and challenging but very rewarding. So I guess that's kind of a once over the world right there for you, Amy. I'm sorry, I don't hear you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that introduction. And for the folks joining us right now, who might have heard and seen these in the news, we're talking about some of the most high-profile cases of our warriors that you're advocating on behalf. But first, I would like to show people, let me go back in the rewind, folks. So this was, if we could just a moment, taking us back about, what, 18 years, maybe 19 years, 18 years, I think, to, this was, I touched down
Afghanistan,
Bagram Air Base in 2000, January 1st, I believe it was 2003. I found you in an ops tent somewhere, and this was the earliest days, some of the first Americans on the ground here in that first year of ops going on there. And there's another one where we did a link up. I was living in Kabul and you were working at Bagram. And so I just wanted to share that we're our first duty station, we were together in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Then we crossed paths again at Camp Pendleton, and then again in Afghanistan, and then through DC. And so I've just watched your career as you went through retirement, and then you worked in the gaming industry in Las Vegas, and then now you've really found a calling. I've seen you do interviews and seen these high profile cases, and we're going to get to that in just a moment. But the emotional roller coaster that's been in the past few years about a lot of these high profile cases of our service members who were charged and convicted of crimes overseas. And then this organization was formed. They chased after you for leadership to get it to a place where you could advocate on their behalf. And through this journey, you've revealed and discovered a lot of improprieties. Now, you're not a lawyer. You don't have a legal background. So a 25-year service, a 25-year career as a Marine infantry officer. Can you tell us, what have you learned so far in this discovery of what was happening to these warriors? Let's take maybe one case that you'd like to discuss, if you can discuss the details, how it came to you and what you learned in this process, and then some of the success you've had with the pardons. What we're looking and talking about are pardons for our warriors under the Trump administration. Yeah,
well, let's backtrack to the founding of this organization back in 2005. Major Donahue, Bill Donahue, was a Marine who served in Vietnam, highly decorated, Silver Star, Bronze Star, 5 Purple Hearts, had been an air crewman, a door gunner, had worked with reconnaissance Marines, conducted reconnaissance missions, and had a significant amount of combat experience. Was also worked as a sniper, and he'd long been retired from the Marines. And all of a sudden, in 2005, there was the Hamdaniya and Haditha cases, which came along, where Marines were being accused of war crimes, and the concern that he had was these were, again, fellow Marines, warriors, who were being paraded through the streets in orange jumpsuits and shackles and were being called murderers before they had even been charged with any crimes. There were just allegations that had been made, and you even had congressmen who were coming out and calling them murderers. And again, there was this. That's a huge amount of unlawful command influence where when you have congressmen and commanders and everybody putting this pressure on the system to convict these warriors. And he actually mortgaged his own house to get this organization started, to give it enough funding to get the marketing and advertising out there, to start raising awareness and to bring on board or to fund attorneys to start fighting these cases on their behalf. And these are civilian attorneys who had tremendous experience in the civilian world or in the military, were JAGs, who then also came over with civilian experience, and they fought these fights and they did it well. And so it's been this ongoing process, because out in the civilian world, the civilian sector, there is truly this demand from our founding that there must be a presumption of innocence. And we would much rather see 1,000 guilty men go free than one innocent person found guilty and incarcerated. And yet in the military, the system has been skewed to where it's not really a system of justice that's trying to seek the truth. The Uniform Code of Military Justice is a tool to be used for discipline. And as such, just a broad example, to be convicted of a crime with a jury, you need a unanimous vote. Everybody there, a jury of peers, must unanimously vote to find you guilty. In the military, number one, it's not a jury of peers, it's a jury of your seniors. And moreover, they don't have to have a unanimous vote. They only need 2/3 to 3/4 of the vote, depending upon the severity of the crime. And so all of a sudden, this court is skewed against the warrior. And we see this time and again where cases are held, are pretty much, if you go to a court martial, depending on time, what time frame we're talking about, it's been as high as 98% conviction rate. And so you're not really talking about a justice system to really balance out whether or not somebody is innocent or guilty. You're going to be guilty. If you go to a court martial, the odds are against you that you're going to walk away without being found guilty. And we find that even when warriors are found not guilty, that there's still a follow-on administrative proceeding to where that stink that was put on you because you even went to a court martial, we're going to make sure that you're administratively separated from the service. So this is, it's a very harsh system, and we have some of the finest warriors that you could think of who are put in really tough situations. And again, some of them make mistakes. And our organization, United American Patriots, makes no excuses for those actions which are inappropriate. And we feel that individuals should be held accountable for inappropriate actions. However, regardless of an individual's actions, there is nothing that anyone can do that allows our government to remove someone's individual rights to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, due process, and fair trials. And what's interesting is in the civilian world, we see this all the time, where individuals who are sitting on death row for committing the most heinous crimes you can imagine that if it's found out that their rights were violated, let's say improper search and seizure, that those individuals will be released. And people will argue that all day long and say, well, they did a horrible crime. They shouldn't be released. And most people have to understand, and in America, what's so amazing about our system is that our individual rights are paramount to any wrongdoing. So any wrongdoing that any individual does not wipe out all of our rights. And if you take away one individual's rights, you're stripping the rights of all, and you're weakening that protection of individuals' rights. So that's sort of a broad overview of where we come in. And I think one of the recent cases, First Lieutenant Clint Lawrence, here was a situation where you had a warrior who made a call for his soldiers to engage 3 individuals on a motorcycle in Afghanistan. And this is a part of the Taliban's Tactics, Techniques, and Procedures, TTPs, where they will come out of patrol or a unit, and it'll be either a VBIED, a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device, and they'll blow up and kill civilians and or military, or they'll come by and they'll drop a bomb off or they'll fire or something like that. And Clint Lawrence, who had worked in the operations center, who was very much aware of the situation where there was IEDs going off sometimes 2, 3 times a day over the preceding months, he realized the threat, and he had made a commitment to himself that he was not going to have any of his soldiers going home in body bags. And he was put in charge of a platoon. He replaced the previous lieutenant who had been blown up, who actually took shrapnel to his abdomen, face, and eyes, and came in, was just there a few days, and made the call. And he made the right call because not one of his soldiers got injured. But in this situation where he told his soldiers to engage, they killed 2 of the 3 on the motorcycle, and was held accountable for killing civilians. And the court-martial that proceeded, they claimed over and again, Clint Lawrence killed civilians. We must hold him accountable for killing civilians. But what the court did not do is they didn't introduce what's called biometrics. And these are DNA evidence and fingerprints and other forms of identification, which our government, the U.S. government, pulls from improvised explosive devices, to where there's usually some sort of residue left on the remains, where they can pull fingerprints and other skin cells, even from where soldiers have twisted wires, and they are able to identify individuals. And we've got these huge databases of all this information, and the government did not introduce any of this information, because had they would have found out that those 3 individuals were Taliban and or were connected to Taliban networks and had actually harmed U.S. servicemen prior. But that information was not introduced in court. There was also an aerostat operator. This is the big balloon in the sky with a video camera. And this operator, he said, look, I saw the Taliban with AK-47s and ICOM radios. So it wasn't just like, I kind of saw. He was very specific. They were shadowing Clint's patrol. And this was the first patrol he took out. And certainly the Taliban, who had just actually removed the previous lieutenant, certainly they're going to test this new lieutenant. And that information was not introduced. There was a SIGACT, a significant activity report, that the U.S. Army wrote about what happened on that day for Clint Lawrence. And they talked about, there was multiple firefights that went on that day, and Clint's unit was being set up for an attack or an ambush. The government hid that report. They didn't even introduce it in court. That's called prosecutorial misconduct. When the prosecution hides exculpatory or exonerating information, that's a criminal act. That's a constitutional violation. And yet they found Clint guilty, not surprisingly, because not only that, but they took his entire unit, they separated them and allowed them to collude and said, we're going to charge you all with murder. And all of a sudden, these guys like, wait a second, we didn't murder anyone. The new guy, the new lieutenant, it was his fault. He called the shots. And of course, people say, well, how can soldiers testify against other soldiers? And people don't realize it. It's not like a football team where everybody's together. You've got a lieutenant, someone who's in charge, who's responsible for good order and discipline, who comes in, takes over a unit, is not liked by these fellow soldiers. He's the new guy. And his job is to try and tighten up this unit that had a lot of disciplinary problems. And so when they were told that they were going to be held accountable for murder, they're like, whoa, what the heck's going on here? And then the command came down and said, all right, we're going to give you all amnesty, but you must testify against this new guy. And they're like, hell yeah, we're going to testify. And so you've got a lopsided group of witnesses that are being forced to testify against this individual. And at the end of the day, one of the charges that were held against Clint Lawrence, or was alleged, was that he changed the rules of engagement, that he wasn't following the government authorized rules of engagement. However, of all the charges, that was the one charge which he was found not guilty. So they got him for ordering his soldiers supposedly to kill civilians. They found him guilty of murder, and they put him away in prison. And when United American Patriots got involved, we were able to take all of this on appeal and bring it to the appeals court. And the job of an appeals court in at least the civilian system is to review this and to see if perhaps there was something that was done wrong in the lower court. But what we found time and again, that instead they circle the wagons and they reinforce, no, everything was fine, everything was done right, and they refuse to rock the boat. So the appeals court, they refused to address any of these wrongdoings. As a matter of fact, while it was undergoing appeal, you actually had a general who's in charge of the appeal system. He went public at an event, and you could go look this up online. It was I believe the 50th anniversary of Vietnam and the My Lai incident, where you had Lieutenant Calley, who went out and was found guilty of killing 116 civilians. And he likened the Clint Lawrence case to the Calley case, and basically said, look, Clint's a bad apple. And he's just like this murderer here. This is while Clint's case is undergoing appeal, he's making public statements. Again, unlawful command influence when a general is doing that. And not only that, but his subordinate is the one who's reviewing the case for appeal. So you know that subordinate is going to be like, oh, the general, my boss, thinks that Clint's guilty? Yeah, he's guilty. I'm not going to put my career on the line for that. And we had a congressman address this with the Judge Advocate General of the Army. And the Judge Advocate General misled this congressman, said, don't get involved. Clint violated the rules of engagement. And not true. He was found not guilty of that. So we know that misinformation is spread. We know that they try to dissuade people from getting involved. But we continued to push because we felt the truth is that important. And ultimately, we were able to work through several congressmen and several people who had influence to elevate this to President Trump at the time. And he reviewed the entire case along with DOJ and the rest. And they recognized that Clint was unjustly incarcerated. And he was able to give him a pardon. He actually called Clint Lawrence in prison. And apparently, he joked with Clint and said, look, by the time this is all done, your record is going to be cleaner than mine. So very prophetic and very interesting. But that was a successful case where we were able to get Clint out by continuing to press the narrative, get the information, and push forward. And there's a picture of Clint in the middle. We're standing there with Congressman Waltz, a special forces officer who went on to become a congressman.
Okay, so what we're seeing here, let me just break this down. We're seeing you with Clint. So during the appeals process and other cases like this, your organization advocates on behalf of these. You have a couple cases that were ongoing, and basically likening it to sort of the Innocence Project, if people are familiar with that, taking on these cases to do a deep dive look and determine if these rights were violated in a military court of law, not the same as a civilian court of law. So military members must take into account that it's a much different ball game. And if you find yourself on the other end of something, you've done something and you don't know where to turn, there's very few advocacy groups that would, are there any others that are also helping get to the heart of the matter, getting to what actually can be done at this point? And so I think they turn to you, your organization, for some sort of reckoning.
Yeah, right now we're the only organization that I'm aware of that's actually been fighting for cases of crimes in combat, or what are individuals are being considered war criminals, where they've been accused of murder in combat. And so we go out there and we support as best we can. And again, we get into discussions all the time about right and wrong and what individuals should have, could have, would have done. And quite frankly, we'll agree that there's some wrongdoing, but that still does not dismiss an individual's rights. And this is where we as warriors, we swear to support and defend the rights of all citizens by supporting our Constitution. And yet, when it comes to the rights of the warriors, even fellow warriors can be like, yeah, they screwed up. They did this wrong or that wrong. And it's almost like the warriors don't get their rights. And what people don't realize is that we have become such a litigious society where everything is so legal right now that when a warrior pulls the trigger in combat, they may end up in Leavenworth, and they may have done something right or wrong. It all depends upon how this works out. And what we've seen time and again is the enemy, they understand this. And they use that against us. And they'll come in and say, oh my God, look at this. This warrior killed all of these civilians, and they killed women and children. And we just jump on the bandwagon. We're like, oh my God, that's horrible. We're going to convict these people. We're going to give them a death sentence. And it's like, wait a second. Did anybody even see the bodies? Oh yeah, well these Afghans, they told us. What Afghans? The Taliban? The enemy? The enemy said that we did something horrific. And we've seen this used against our warriors all the time. The first time that MARSOC, the Marine Special Operations Command, was deployed, they were so effective, and the enemy was so fearful of these new warriors that just hit the battlefield that the first ambush against them, the Marines slaughtered these guys, and they were so effective that the Afghans immediately came out and go, oh my God, there's a new sheriff in town. And what did they do? They're like, these guys killed civilians. And all of a sudden, everybody was like, whoa, hold on a second. What's going on here? And the Army Special Operations Command, like, oh my God, we can't have these guys killing civilians. And they kicked the Marines out of country. And, the Taliban were laughing. They're like, oh my God, that really worked. We were able to claim that Fred Galvin, this amazing freaking warrior, this special operator who is leading some of the best United States Marines, we were able to get him kicked out of country. I don't know that something like that has ever happened before. And yet it did. And it took several years of this amazing raider, Fred Galvin, to fight back and to actually get that case overturned, to realize that there was never any evidence that they had done anything wrong. As a matter of fact, all the evidence showed that they acted appropriately. But it took a long time, and they're still fighting to make sure that those Marines get their Raider insignias, because those Raider insignias were authorized after this incident. So there's a lot of injustices that happen all the time, and a lot of time, because everything's so political, there are these knee-jerk reactions from the senior leadership that people are concerned for their careers, because politically there's so much influence here, and it goes away from the actual tactics and the operational environment and the evidence, which may not support the allegations. And here in a civilian community, if there's no evidence to support allegations, for the most part, certainly we see the system go wrong, that you can't convict someone. you have to find there has to be some bodies. There has to be some evidence. One of the recent cases we fought for was
Let me ask you about this. Let me jump into through these discovery periods where you're digging into the details, really, and you've had conversations with other senior military officers and other lawmakers, really, who are very afraid, makes them nervous about what you're trying to achieve, because of the political ramifications and the perception of, I can't advocate for the release of someone who has committed these crimes, even though they didn't get a fair trial. Can you talk to us about what you've experienced in this roller coaster of trying to share with them there is no evidence, but yet, and their trial was not a fair trial in the legal sense. What surprised you most?
Well, look, in general, all of this surprised me. And as we talked about earlier, a former battalion commander of mine, when I was a young second lieutenant, he was on the board of United American Patriots, and he tried to get me on board UAP for 3 years, literally. And I refused to listen to him because I was convinced that if you actually had someone in the military commit a war crime, and then our Uniform Code of Military Justice, which is run by our military, found those guys guilty, that, our military, which is full of honorable individuals, honor, courage, commitment, that if they found them guilty, and by God, they're freaking guilty. And why would we care about them? Because, I've had multiple tours of combat, and I'm proud to say that none of the Marines I've ever served with or sailors ever committed any war crimes. And so these individuals, it's actually a stain on the heroic and honorable work that all of these other warriors have actually done. And it took a long time and showing me a lot of evidence and really digging into these cases to understand that there's something amiss here. And, people have challenged me. They're like, well, don't you love, our country? Yeah, of course I do. Well, don't you love our armed forces? Of course I do. And, well, don't you love our warriors? I said, more than you'll ever know. As anybody who's ever served with me or within my commands knows, I'll go toe to toe with anyone to fight for all of my Marines any single day, anywhere. But there is a cancer within the armed forces. And it's just like my wife. When she came down with cancer, I didn't stop loving her. Like, I dug in deeper. Like, I said, we're going to figure out whatever it is to make sure we remove this cancer so that she bounces back stronger and more healthy than she was before. And there was absolutely no way that I would stop loving my wife. And, God bless her. She's bounced back and she's freaking sprinting 3 miles every day, making me look like an old man. But so she's heroic in her own sense. But that being said, when you look now at the armed forces and say, well, what's the cancer here? How is it that we can make our armed forces healthier? And it's the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And this is where, time and again, you have individuals who are not warriors. They haven't gone and served in combat. And they're not now just coming back, all right, let's look at these cases. These are professional judge advocates who they decide, you know what, I'd like to go to law school, but I can't afford it. But guess what? If I decide to commit to serving in the Army or the Navy or Air Force or Marines for a certain period of time, the government will pay for my law school. And all I've got to do is go through 18 weeks of knife and fork school, learn how to wear my uniform, and I'm off and running. And I don't want to besmirch all of the people who served in the JAG Corps, because there's many that they're very honorable. But there's also a significant amount that realizes that for them to get their career promotions, it's not about going into combat and stacking bodies. It's about stacking bodies in the courtroom. And moreover, if they've got a capital punishment, a murder case, that if they can prove that in trial here, that sets them up for success when they decide to go be attorneys on the outside. Now, again, it's not all attorneys that are like that, but the system has allowed enough of these attorneys to act with impunity. which means that in the history of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, not one attorney has been held criminally accountable for criminal activity. As such, those few that decide to act inappropriately, why not? There's no downside. There's tremendous upside. If they win these cases, it's going to help their career, their promotion, their job prospects when they get out. And if they get caught, no big deal. And, we saw this most recently in Chief Gallagher's case. And I know that Chief Gallagher's case, there's a lot of controversy about that, a lot of questions about that. But at the end of the day, we know for a fact that the prosecution put spyware on the emails that he was using to communicate with the defense attorneys to spy on the attorney-client privilege. This is a sacred communication. This is a constitutional right that you're allowed to speak to your attorney without having that information shared publicly. And yet they were spying on that information. That right there is a violation. And yet the attorney who did that, and nobody disputed it, it was fact. No criminal punishment, wasn't held accountable. They decided, well, let's just move him off this case. So there was administrative action, but that individual should stand trial and should be held accountable for inappropriate actions. But it doesn't happen. And that's where the system is an insulated system where you have a convening authority that oversees both the defense and the prosecution and selects the jury and has influence on how that is all going to come out. Very different from the civilian world. It doesn't all fit in one nice, neat package there. So these are things that are challenging.
Sure, and I think with the sexual assault situation in the military too, that's becoming more and more known, and there's been some advocacy to take that out of the military court systems. But you mentioned a few high-profile cases that people may have been following. And folks, if you're just joining us, I'm talking with the CEO of United American Patriots, an advocacy group for our warriors who have maybe had an unfair trial, and Bull has been instrumental in the past few years to seek out justice or some sort of making things right. Can you talk to these particular cases, which we talked about the Lawrence case, but under the Trump administration, when President Trump took office, you probably thought, okay, now we've got our work cut out for us. And it really started to build momentum with these clemencies and pardons. Can you just briefly tell us, that turning point for each of these cases here?
Yeah, well, one of the cases that's not up here was actually the first pardon that President Trump actually acted on behalf of our warriors. And it's First Lieutenant Michael Behenna. And it's important in that case to talk about the details where in Behenna's situation that he captured an individual that was known to him and others for conducting terrorist activity against our troops and brought him in to be held, to be interrogated and all the rest. And the higher up said, no, this guy's not on our VIP list, so let him go. And Behenna said, well, no, I'm not letting this guy go. And he decides to go and interrogate him on his own. And during the interrogation, that supposedly this individual attacked Behenna, and Behenna acted in self-defense and fired on this detainee and killed him. Well, what's interesting in that case is that unlike many of these cases, and I think the government's learned, like they can get a conviction without a body. In this case, they decided to get the conviction with the body, and they actually hired an expert to come in and to conduct a forensic autopsy on the detainee. And the expert came out, this is the prosecution's expert, and said, look, everything I can tell you from how the bullets entered the body and all the way the individual was at the time, First Lieutenant Behenna acted in self-defense. Everything he's saying is 100% accurate. So what did the prosecution do? Well, they fired the expert and they hid the report. And they found Behenna guilty of murdering a detainee. And again, under appeal, United American Patriots and the rest bring this up and say, look, this expert has actually testified that Behenna's communication, everything he said about the situation is accurate. And in the appeals court, they said, well, that didn't matter. Well, okay, that does matter. When there's prosecutorial misconduct, that's a constitutional violation. But moreover, they say it didn't matter because Behenna was told to release the detainee and he didn't. And as such, he lost his right to self-defense. Okay, now that's freaking insane. Okay, that our warriors never lose their right to self-defense. And moreover, Lieutenant Behenna has all the right in the world to interrogate a detainee, and that's exactly what he was doing. So again, that was the first pardon that President Trump came out and gave this pardon to Michael Behenna. Great individual, and I was fortunate enough to actually meet him. So we had him, we had Clint Lawrence, and then Matt Goldstein, Army Special Forces, similar situation where they had a detainee, and this detainee had been involved in killing 2 United States Marines who actually were serving with Matt Goldstein, Army Special Forces commander. And the whole case came about when Matt was being recruited by the CIA. And during a polygraph, they discussed this incident, and Matt told the truth. He said, yeah, we had this detainee. We were told to release him, but I knew that the reason we had picked him up was because the local villagers, to which he had a great relationship with, that this detainee was going to go back and harm those individuals. And basically, Matt established an ambush to observe. There was only one way back into that village, and sure enough, there was the detainee going back towards that village, which he had no reason to go there. And Matt ambushed this guy. That's a legally justifiable tactical operation, and he clearly identified this enemy combatant, ambushed him, and killed him. So this case, when he communicated this to the CIA reviewed it, and they said, yeah, nothing wrong, and we're going to actually go and give you an offer to come join our organization. And Matt was all about to do that, but for some reason, and we still don't know why, that someone within the CIA leaked that information to the Army. And the Army all of a sudden is like, whoa, hold on a second. That sounds like he murdered someone. And they brought a case against him. And again, they couldn't find the evidence to support this, but that they weren't going to let it go. So they put him on this indefinite hold, which then the CIA said, all right, we're going to withdraw our offer until obviously you're released from the Army and this whole thing is cleared up. And the case went on and on for nearly a decade. And, that justice delayed is not justice served. And, he had a right to a speedy trial to get this over with. And Matt wanted to go to trial. He's like, look, if you're going to go to trial, let's do this. And it didn't happen. The Army delayed it. And then Matt was interviewed and he was on TV and he was asked, about this incident. And he told the whole story again. Now, the media picked up on it and said, oh, look, he admitted to murder. No, he didn't admit to murder. And murder is a legal definition. And he was not found guilty of murder, and he didn't commit murder. He did admit to killing the enemy, which is what we're trained to do: locate, close with, and destroy the enemy. So Matt, his was another case where it delayed and delayed. And I actually went to one of his motions hearings, and they had sent an investigator to Afghanistan to get more information. Like, we're going to try and find more information. And they find these 2 individuals that supposedly were related to the supposed detainee that was murdered. And it was absolutely insane. This investigator goes, yeah, I brought them both into the same room and I started talking to them. It's like, wait a second, is that how you're supposed to interrogate someone? Well, no, but in this case, we didn't have enough people to separate them. Like, wait a second, this is a murder case. You're trying to hold a warrior, a special operator, one of the best, accountable for murder, and you're just going to be sloppy in your interviews? Now, how did you know that these guys were who they said they were? Oh, well, the locals told us. Okay, well, did you check their ID? Well, they didn't have ID. Well, then why'd you bring them on the base? You're not allowed to bring just some random individuals. Well, we had to bring them somewhere to interrogate them. Right. But you brought these individuals on the base without ID, interrogated them as if they were who they were, which we have no idea who they were. And they were sitting here side by side, listening to each other's stories to make sure that everybody was telling the right story, knowing that they were coming from a highly concentrated Taliban area. Everything about it was just a ridiculous scam. And when the defense said, hey, we want to interview these guys as well. Oh, well, you can't do that. They're in Afghanistan. Fly them in. No, we're not going to fly them in. Fine, then we'll go to Afghanistan. And, the court's like, well, and they're like, well, then Matt Goldstein has to go to Afghanistan. Matt was like, fine, I'll go back there. Like, let's get to the truth. And this whole thing, it was totally inappropriate how this case was being handled. And the president stepped in and he dismissed the charges with prejudice and said, it's not being handled appropriately. Justice is not being served. And so that case was taken out. And so, those were the three that we were mainly involved in. We did support Eddie Gallagher's case initially. It was taken over by the Navy SEAL Fund, and they ended up carrying through with Eddie's case. And again, ultimately, in that situation, he was found not guilty in the actual court. In addition to constitutional rulings that were wrong, another SEAL said, look, I killed the detainee that Eddie Gallagher didn't. Like, yeah, Eddie may have stabbed him with a knife, but I'm the one that actually killed the detainee. And so they had to drop the charges. And then it came into the question, well, the Navy said, well, we're going to do follow-on actions, and we're going to take away his rank, and we're going to not allow him to retire. And the president stepped in and said, no, you violated this individual's rights. And you may not like what Chief Gallagher did, but you violated his rights. And again, that has to be paramount, is individuals' rights must supersede any wrongdoing, or else we're in this slippery slope where all of a sudden we start chipping away at individuals' rights, and it sets a precedent, a bad precedent. And so that has to be preserved at all cost.
Well, it's been fascinating to watch through the years, to watch you advocate for these high-profile cases. Now, moving forward, there is another high-profile case. The election came and went. President Trump obviously didn't win. The Biden administration. Where do you go from here for some of the cases that are still pending, that you feel that you've taken on? You have agreed that there's merit there for an unfair case of conviction. Most notably, I'm going to show his picture. It's the Robert Bales case. And so some people may obviously have seen his name and his face and maybe don't understand what the media have portrayed, but can you walk us through this situation?
Yeah, so Bob Bales it's a very tough situation from a public relations perspective, in that the initial stories that came out was that Bob Bales killed, actually the initial story was they killed 17. It turned out to be 16, and a significant portion of them were women and children, and it was considered the Kandahar massacre. And a horrific story. And anybody who would think that our servicemen enjoy going out and killing women and children simply don't understand what our warriors do. And what happened in his situation is that before any charges were brought about, before there was any evidence, before anything other than the allegations that were coming from the Afghans, President Obama came out and said, we will prosecute this case aggressively. I have directed my military to prosecute this case aggressively. Now, maybe people don't understand the context there. He didn't say we will investigate this case aggressively, which means let's find out the truth. Instead, he said he already made the predetermination that Bales was guilty and they were going to prosecute. So they already are there saying, we're going to prosecute this aggressively. And Defense Secretary Leon Panetta came out and said, and the death penalty is on the table. Wait a second. We don't even know the facts yet. And all of a sudden, you've got the two most senior people in the Department of Defense, the Commander-in-Chief and the Secretary of Defense, already condemning this individual. Now, what's disturbing about this case is many different things, but the first individuals within hours of the alleged massacre were Afghan equivalent of CID, criminal investigators, who went to the villages to see what had actually happened. And when they went there, they came under fire from the individuals in these villages. Now, for those who are not familiar with Afghanistan, the only people that shoot at Afghan soldiers are Taliban. Okay, the locals aren't shooting at the Afghan soldiers. And so it's reasonable to believe that these areas which were known Taliban strongholds had the Taliban come in here and now said, hold on a second, we're going to control the narrative. And so they didn't allow the investigators in. As a matter of fact, they killed one of the Afghan soldiers. And by the time the Afghans were allowed to go in and investigate what actually happened, all the bodies were gone. There was not one body. And they had already cleaned out much of the areas in which the crimes actually had occurred, or the alleged crimes. So if you talk to Bob Bales, as I have multiple times, one of the first conversations I had with him was very telling, where I said, I'm not an attorney, and I don't care about being politically correct. And I was like, Bob, what the hell? You killed 16 and most of them were women and children? And Bob goes, no, I killed 20. And, that's not something you expect to hear from somebody who's sitting in prison for life, to up the ante. And he goes, and they weren't all women and children. I went out in town to kill enemy combatants. And that's exactly what I did. And the reason they're only going to give you 16 names is because the 4 additional individuals were high-ranking Taliban. And they're not going to acknowledge that they were killed. And they're not even going to let anybody know what ever happened. And quite frankly, we have no idea if the 16 that were allegedly killed actually were women or children. We have no idea, because there was no forensics. There was no autopsy. There was no evidence. And by the time we actually had U.S. investigators go into scenes 3 weeks later, the crime scenes had been sanitized. And, the lead prosecutor even talked about, like, there was a pile of brass, but we don't know if the brass was from this village or another village. And, we have no idea where it came from. But they claimed, these were the rounds that were fired by Bob Bales. And the witnesses said, multiple people came into the village and started killing people. Well, the prosecution, again, said we had to convince them that they were wrong, that it was only one person, Bob Bales. Wait a second. Why are you tampering with the witnesses? Why are you trying to convince them that what they observed was wrong? How do you know that the Taliban didn't come in to make this situation worse than it actually was? It's possible Bob didn't kill anyone, and he may have injured people, and perhaps the Taliban came in and made the scene worse than it was to make sure it would be reported differently. But we don't know, because the witnesses weren't able to actually testify what they observed. They testified what they were coached to say. Now, this is where it gets more interesting. That at the Article 32 hearing to lead up to this, there are known Taliban enemy that were actually witnesses. So again, think about this. We're at war, and we now ask the enemy if they think that Bob Bales should be killed. Should a U.S. serviceman be held accountable, and we kill him, put him up for the death sentence? And the enemy, they're like, yeah, that's a great idea. Like, why wouldn't they try to get this guy killed? So that Article 32, then they were able to pressure Bob Bales and say, listen, we're holding the death sentence over your head. And you had the U.S. government you had the Afghan government, you had the entire world, you had the media, you had the prosecution, everybody condemning this guy, Bob Bales, for doing these horrific acts, which again, absolutely no evidence, no supporting evidence. And they pressured him. And his own defense attorney said, listen, just admit to this, give this admission, and we'll be able to get the death sentence off the table. And moreover, they're saying, look, you have to understand, U.S. servicemen are being killed overseas because of your actions. If you just admit to this, it'll put an end to it and will save U.S. service lives. And his own wife, and this is interesting because many times when we see these cases, that marriages don't last. And especially if someone's going away for life, wives end up parting ways. And in this case, Bob Bales' wife, even after he was convicted, and he was actually charged with life without the possibility of parole, she moved from Seattle to Kansas City, to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, to be closer to her husband so that her two children could spend time with her husband. And their children have a great relationship. They're amazing kids. I've met them. They're very well adjusted. And they used to, before COVID, they used to go into prison all the time. And Bob would help them with their homework. And even now to this day, he talks to them on the phone and coaches Bobby Jr. and how to play football. And he's a very engaged and involved father, really a unique individual. And so that being said, everybody say, look, just make this confession and the death sentence off the table. So Bob really didn't have anybody on his side at the time. And he made the confession. And if you read the confession, it's very contrived. It says, I of sound mind and knowing completely well of what I was doing, chose to do that. And it's a lot of legalese. It's not like if, I wrote something like, I stole the candy bar and I shouldn't have done it. This was a very legal document. And ultimately, they then went they didn't go to a trial. There was no reason for a trial. There was no reason for due process because now Bob had confessed. So they went right to a sentencing hearing. And this is where it gets worse. The U.S. government, the prosecution, then worked with the State Department to fly in what they said were Afghan farmers. And they said to the jury, these are just local farmers. And we're going to talk about how this impacted their lives. And Haji Wazir, he lost all of these people and his family and all the rest. And Haji Wazir is Taliban. And multiple people that were witnesses against Bob Bales, they were enemy combatants. Their fingerprints, their skin cells, their DNA showed up on evidence that was used to harm U.S. servicemen. So our government colluded with the Taliban to sentence Bob Bales and flew them in here. But where it gets worse is we conducted a FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, and found out that they flew them in under aliases, fake names, and said that they were government contractors, lied about their employment to bring them in, took them to SeaWorld, took them out to dinner, and then flew them back after they testified. So if they were truly just farmers, why didn't they just fly them in as farmers? But they didn't, and they put them on Delta Airlines alongside unsuspecting U.S. citizens sitting next to Taliban bomb makers on a civilian airline. And, the government's like, oh, well, everything was safe and we had security and this and that. Like, wait a second. Think about what's happening. U.S. government personnel are colluding with enemy combatants to prosecute and hold accountable a U.S. serviceman. So I don't care. Like, you could talk all day long about what Bob Bales may or may not have done right and wrong, but at the end of the day, that's a horrible precedent to set. And so there's other issues that came out there with Bob Bales' case, and one of them is that part of the evidence that was not introduced was that Bob Bales had taken mefloquine. What's mefloquine? A lot of soldiers know it as Lariam. This is an anti-malaria drug. And there's a lot of concerns with how this drug has impacted servicemen. As a matter of fact, in 2002, when I was in Afghanistan, 3 Army Special Forces soldiers came back to North Carolina, and 3 of them killed their wives, and 2 of them took their own lives. That's not normal. Okay, our warriors don't do that. Now, there's sometimes you can say there's some problems reintegrating. People aren't going around killing their wives and killing themselves. And the one key element in all this was that they took this drug, Lariam, methylquin, and we know that this drug has caused psychotic episodes and it's caused problems. And we were able to go out and hire the foremost experts in this drug, Dr. Nevin and other doctor to come in that actually evaluated Bob Bales and said, oh, yeah, obviously he was under methylquin intoxication, that he was poisoned by this drug, which was impacting his ability to think rationally. And yet the government didn't even introduce this as a possibility when they were trying to figure out his mental state. And yet anybody who knows Bob Bales' case, where he left the base by himself to go out and hunt down Taliban, the first thing anybody who's been in combat will tell you, like, all right, dude, that's crazy. Okay, got it. Nobody's going to argue with you. And yet they didn't find him crazy because they didn't want to find him crazy, because they want to hold him accountable for murder. And we don't hold individuals accountable for murder if they're not in their right mind, if their mens rea is not clear in their motivation. And so this is where Bob Bales received less of the protection of his rights than if somebody went into a local high school and gunned down a bunch of children. That the first thing you're going to say is like, all right, that dude's freaking crazy. Like, let's back this up and let's figure out what's going on. And they didn't give Bob that same evaluation of the situation. And so I think the final piece that has to be understood in Bob Bales' case is the concept of collateral damage. And if we go with the assumption that Bob Bales was telling the truth, that he went out in town with the intent to kill enemy combatants and actually did kill enemy combatants. Let's just for a second, let's just assume that that's correct. Now we can't say it's not correct, because here again, I've got a picture here. This is Haji Wazir. This is the Taliban. This is where we got most of our evidence from. And just to show you, like in a video of him talking about this case, like he actually has a tattoo on his hand, and that tattoo, I think I can show you a clearer picture of. It's, the crossed swords. Like this is a Taliban tattoo. So this guy, he was the lead witness against Bob Bales. So if we assume that Bob Bales was telling the truth, that he went out in town to kill Taliban, and yet killed civilians, horrible. Like anybody who kills civilians, like that's a horrible situation. But the laws of armed conflict actually allow for civilians to be killed, and it's horrible. And trust me, war is horrible. But if we're going with the assumption that Bob Bales actually did kill enemy combatants, and while he was doing that he actually ended up killing some civilians, well, then we have to understand that those civilians should be considered collateral damage, not civilians that were murdered. And so this is very important, that was never brought into situation. He never had his due process. And so what ends up happening is you've got a situation where, the Haji Mena wedding party, where we went in and we killed dozens of people, including 39 women and children. We wrote them all off and said, well, that's those are collateral damage, happens. But it didn't happen in Bob Bales' case. And there was a lot of political pressure from the president on down, who was trying to get a strategic partnership agreement, a status of forces agreement, to try and draw down U.S. troops' involvement in Afghanistan, to basically give in to the Afghan government and say, yeah, we're going to hold Bob Bales accountable for murder. And you can understand it from a political standpoint, but now you're talking about an individual's life, and there has to be a review that goes back here and says, look, the individual's rights are paramount to even politics. So Bob Bales, it's a very tough case in that the narrative is so strong against him, but it's one of those things where you can't violate an individual's rights.
This is just amazing. And we follow these cases, and you see it on the news, but the news barely scratches the surface of what are the actual details, because there isn't enough time to go into the fact checking and the research that's needed in order to understand how complex these cases are. But you and your team have really been there in lockstep to understand and FOIA items and information to get to the root of the problem and talk to these people. And you've gotten the attention of people in Congress and media and other, high influence voices that have reached the president, at this time President Trump, to get the pardons for these cases. Now, you still have some work to do because there are still some people you're advocating on behalf of.
Sure.
So this is just really deep, and we really appreciate you coming on and breaking this down. It's just, for anyone who serves in uniform, that could be me. And I've served 5 combat tours, and luckily, I wasn't injured or killed, and I wasn't forced with those situations. But if I were, and there will be future cases, and a legal system within the military that is very difficult, and unless you've been faced with it yourself, you just don't even know the power that is just overwhelming. These people don't have resources to pay for high-powered attorneys, and even then, they definitely cannot get the nuanced details. And these people all probably had attorneys appointed or paid for, but who were not able to get into the heart of the matter, which you've been able to do.
Yeah, it's challenging, and we, right now we're focusing on a few cases. Like you said, we've got the MARSOC 3. I'm actually wearing their emblem. This Lady Justice carrying an M4, and she's, justice is not being served here. You got 2 gunnery sergeants, Gunnery Sergeant Danny Dreyer and Gunnery Sergeant Josh Legrone, and Chief Eric Gilmet. These are amazing. Some of the best, like Eric Gilmet, Special Operations Independent Duty Corpsman, one of the most highly trained and proficient medical professionals that we have. And these 2 gunnery sergeants, these raiders, are the best of the best. And they're being held accountable to try and prove a point. And there's not been the political will of the commanders to do the right thing when there's evidence showing that they acted 100% appropriately, and they tried to avoid a conflict. And when they did act, they acted in self-defense and defense of others. And yet their case continues to move down the road towards a court-martial. And it's one of these things where it shouldn't even be considered at a court-martial. And we've got John Hatley, First Sergeant John Hatley, multiple combat tours, who we were hoping to get a pardon for. And unfortunately, we were not in this time around, but we were able to get him paroled and out of prison. He was put away for life for a murder of 4 individuals, yet nobody ever had any bodies. As a matter of fact, the bodies were supposedly thrown into a canal. CID put scuba divers into the canal. Could not find, not even a body. They couldn't find one shred of evidence. They searched the canal bank where there should have been blood spatter, or there should have been some casings or bullets or some fragments of clothing. Nothing. Found 0 evidence. And they even went to the villages where supposedly these 4 people came from to talk about, who's missing. No one's missing. Well, somebody must be. Nope, nobody's missing. Like, we're here to give you salation payments. Who wants to collect this money? We're not collecting money because no one's dead. So they had no names, no evidence, no bodies, nothing. And they found him, yet they found this first sergeant guilty of murder. And they put him away for life. Fortunately, we were able to get that broken down and get him out on parole, but there's still this conviction hanging over his head. Sergeant Derek Miller, another warrior, we were able to get him paroled, but we're still trying to get him pardoned. And the good and the bad news is that everything we were doing was right. We got these cases to the point where they were all going to get pardoned, 8 warriors. And unfortunately, because of the political situation around what happened on the Capitol on January 6th, the president backed away from these pardons and these paroles and these turning around a lot of these cases. And if you notice, of all the pardons, there was not one pardon that came out that was related in this last batch to any violent crimes. And a lot of that was the president, I believe, being told to step away from anything related to violent crime because he was facing his own challenges. And that's very frustrating. But that being said, we're going to continue to press. We're going to hope that President Biden is going to review these cases, and he's going to take into account that right now that the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, for all intents and purposes, are over. We're in final negotiations with Afghanistan. Thousands of Taliban enemy combatants are being released. We're down to the last few. There's 150 of whom who are sitting on death row for the most heinous and horrific crimes you could imagine. And if we're going to release them to help bring this conflict to an end, then certainly President Biden should recognize that we should not, the only people sitting in prison should not be U.S. servicemen after all is said and done. I mean, even if you go back to President Carter, that he came out and he gave amnesty to all of the deserters who went to Canada during the Vietnam War, because he realized that, you know what, it's time to bring closure to this. And I think it's time to bring closure to the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. And there's plenty of arguments that can be made that our government did not prosecute these conflicts appropriately, despite all of the heroism of all of our warriors who fought valiantly on the battlefield, that our government had an opportunity to actually prosecute these wars effectively. Think about it. World War II, from our involvement, was over in 4 years. And now we're going on 2 decades in Afghanistan and close to that in Iraq. There's something wrong when our government, the civilian leadership, is not able to bring to bear the resources when we've got the finest warriors in the world, the best technology, the best education, the best leadership, the best camaraderie, that our warriors can't end conflicts? Of course they can. And if they're allowed to do what has to be done and there's a clear objective on what is going to be accomplished, there is nothing our warriors can't accomplish. So with all that being said, President Biden was vice president for 8 years over these 2 conflicts. And I think that he's in a good position to really bring this whole thing to closure. And so we're hoping that we're going to see that from President Biden.
Well, we're very hopeful as well. And just to continue the great work that you guys have been doing and shining a light in a very dark chapter in this for our brothers, service members. And we're always asked to do something incredible. And you go to war and fighting people that don't wear uniforms and don't have allegiance to a country is very ambiguous situation, and it's very difficult decision. So these guys, do you stay in touch with the ones that were pardoned? You touch base with them and check on them, I'm sure, and you just can see them they're going to go on to do great things.
Well, and that's the thing is, one of the things that has to be also understood, there has never been one case of recidivism of a war criminal. That you've never seen one guy come out of prison after he's been accused of even murder that has come out and murdered someone else. These are not criminals. These are not criminals at all. These are political cases that are held accountable that may have done wrongdoing, but they're not coming back to the same situation. Whereas the Taliban, they're going back to the battlefield. So it's not a matter of recidivism. They're just going back to doing what they're doing. And they're being combatants. And we know this. They've been picked up again on the battlefield, even though they've been told, don't go back. Like, all right. And they go back. And so we don't see that from many of our warriors. We don't see them committing crimes. We see them going on. Like, for example, Clint Lawrence right now, he's in law school. And, he's going to go be an attorney. But he's going to have a tough time passing a state's bar because he's still considered a felon. And he still has a conviction of murder hanging over his head. And so in his case, we continue to fight in what's called a habeas corpus, in which it's this writ of habeas corpus where we've taken his case and all of our warriors' cases where their rights are violated out of the military system and put them into a federal court for review. And again, it's a very tough process. It's a painstaking process. It takes a long time. And the attorneys that are doing this are well underpaid what they should be getting paid to fight these cases. And we do the best we can to finance this. but they continue to fight these cases to bring to light the wrongdoing that's happened and have this oversight. So we continue to fight for Clint and others to make sure that they're going to have their names cleared, just as President Trump said, that they're going to have a clean record. So we continue to fight it, and it's a long slog. It really is. But I as I said, as we talked earlier, I talk to our guys who are still in prison. I talk to them once a week, and they're good human beings. The one case I think we didn't talk about was Calvin Gibbs. They actually made two movies about him, a documentary and a Hollywood feature called The Kill Squad. And yet Calvin was not even consulted on either of them. Nobody even talked about him. This was a total hit job, and they got all the facts wrong. And the fact of the matter is, Calvin's in prison for 3 counts of murder, 2 situations he wasn't even at the scene of the crime. He was not even there. And the third one, the witness who said that they acted appropriately and they engaged the enemy combatant consistent with the rules of engagement, he was not even allowed to testify. And so Calvin's in prison for crimes he did not commit, and we're fighting for him. We're trying to get him out. But again, these are really, really tough cases because, again, when you've got movies already coming out against you, when we're talking to people saying, hey, will you support Calvin Gibbs? And they're like, oh, yeah, this is horrible. We tell them all the facts, and we get individuals behind this, some people of influence, people with money. And then they go off and they watch these movies and they're like, oh, my God, this is horrible. I'm not supporting this. And I'm like, yes, but that's not factually accurate. Yeah, but even still, people are going to think that's what really happened, and I don't want to be associated with that. It's like, well, you're here to help tell the truth, to clear the narrative up so that these propaganda films are not going to be something that tell a story that's not true. And we've seen this time and again where supposed historical movies, they're not historical, and they don't tell the truth. And this is a case where Calvin Gibbs, he's in a situation where he's fighting his uphill battle of this perception based upon lies that were told by other people. And we've seen this in time and time again, all of these cases, and it's very, very hard. And that's why we try and get out in front of these cases before they go to court-martial. And we've been successful in quite a few in where the narratives come out and we're able to fight this and show there's no evidence to bring these cases to trial. And we're able to win the day by having cases dismissed. But getting to that point is very tough because a lot of times, we have to know about these cases as they're occurring. And it's and look, these guys, they're really good people. The Warriors we're supporting, they're really they're really stellar individuals.
Well, David, I mean, you could be doing 1,000 other things right now with your background, your education, your experience, but you've chosen this path, or it's chosen you to do this work in order to spread the word. People can learn more about UAP at uap.org to get the help that they need, take a look at the cases, understand the facts. We are so happy to learn more about this from you because without those warriors, we're nothing, right? Without the warriors that are in the pipeline coming at the next generation. We're going on 20 years after 9/11, and we still have these cases that are lingering. And so I hope that this brings and sheds light on a very difficult subject and a lot of misinformation out there. It sounds like people are very misinformed. Not any fault of their own. It's just the media doesn't tend to dive into the facts. And so
and we're a community of headlines. We read headlines and we move on, and it's easier. And as I said, it took a long time for me to really dive in, to even be motivated to dive into these cases. But it's, once you do, it's like taking the red pill. Once you know the truth, it's like, all right, you can't back out now. You can't leave these guys in prison. It's not just for them. It's for the follow-on people. And I'll just, I know we're trying to wrap up here, but there's one quick story I want to tell where people say, well, we have to hold them accountable for good order and discipline. And it's like, no, you're missing it. Good order and discipline means that you're treating these warriors with the rights they deserve. And when you have a case like Clint Lawrence, where he ordered his soldiers to open fire on enemy combatants coming towards his patrol on a motorcycle, and now you have soldiers saying, whoa, even though that is appropriate and it's consistent with the rules of engagement, I don't know if I'm going to do that because I don't want to end up in Leavenworth. So I'm just going to perhaps ignore it. And that's exactly what happened not long after Clint Lawrence's case. When everybody knew what happened to Clint Lawrence, there was a security patrol outside of Bagram, where both you and I have served. And sure enough, an individual on a motorcycle came cruising towards a security patrol, and they all sat here, and they were all within their rights to open fire, consistent with rules of engagement, and yet they chose not to. Now, I would love to sit here and ask them and say, well, why didn't you open fire? But I can't, because all 5 of them are dead. They all were killed. This was a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device. So the only thing that we can presume is that they chose not to engage, consistent with the rules of engagement, because they were more concerned about being accounted as murderers and sent to prison.
And this is a big fear for military members who go forward and downrange is, will I make the right decision? Will someone second guess my judgment and not give me the benefit of the doubt on those cases? But this is an interesting twist. So I want to leave on an upbeat note, because this is where it gets very interesting, where life imitates art. So the commands that we choose to obey and the commands we choose to ignore, we simply do not have the option when you're in the military, right? I mean, there are lawful orders and then there are non-lawful orders. So this takes me to your experience where you played the part. Now, folks at home, if you're watching, you may recognize David from a very famous movie where they're inside of a courtroom, right? A legal courtroom, one of the most famous movies out there, where David is playing a Marine Sergeant bailiff. Tell us the story, David, and I'm going to show some pictures where you are inside the courtroom standing with Jack Nicholson playing the colonel in A Few Good Men. And so you were already in the Marines, but now you're selected to be a part of this experience inside of a courtroom about a legal case with Marines being judged on what orders they can and cannot follow. I mean, the irony here is just, you cannot make this up, right? Because now here you are, that was years later, you served in Guantanamo Bay, and now here you are several years later, 30 years later, advocating on behalf of Marines who are in court, Marines and service members finding themselves in a court of law based on lawful or unlawful orders or things that they've done. So describe us here where you are.
Yeah. So, my job was to keep Tom Cruise alive when Colonel Nathan Jessup, Jack Nicholson, was going to rip out I think he was going to rip off his head and crap down his neck or something along those lines. But that was an interesting time, and it's the only thing that if anybody's stuck around this long, this is the only thing anybody's really going to care about, is that I was there on the left. That was playing this MP, and the individual to the other side of Tom Cruise, he actually played a Klingon in Star Trek movies, and a couple of times he would have to leave the set early to go get his Klingon makeup on. So yeah, that was an interesting time on the set where I was one of the few Marines there that was actually being asked, like, hey, make sure people's uniforms are correct and make sure everything's being done properly as per Marines. And Jack, he was great. He loved everybody on the set, and he was funny as heck. Tom Cruise, he had his own personality quirks. As a matter of fact, he and I had a little disagreement on the set where I was talking to the makeup guys and said, hey, don't put too much makeup on me. I don't want people confusing me for Cruz. And he got upset. He was like, what's that? And I said, look, I don't want anybody to think that I'm you. And he goes, yeah, don't worry about that, because then you'd have to get a real job and a real life. I was like, wait, what? And so before I could even think of like a snappy comeback, Rob Reiner, who was the director, he said action, and all of a sudden Jack Nicholson's coming at Cruz, and instead of me grabbing Nicholson, I just stepped back and bam, Nicholson came flying through, knocked Cruz on his back, and freaking Nicholson came up laughing. He was like, he's like, bull, that was freaking awesome. He loved it. Cruz was not so happy. he uh, he came up yelling and getting in my face. And, fortunately, quick thinking, I realized, look, if I hit Cruz, I go to jail for the rest of my life. And so, yeah, I was smart enough to back down and just say, I'm out of here. I'm off the set. And what was ironic is, everybody's like, wait a second, if this big Marine walks off the set, we're going to have to reshoot all these scenes all over again. And so anyway, bottom line is they talked me back onto the set, and, Cruz was told, hey, go apologize to this guy. He's an actual Marine. And yeah, there's Demi Moore. I'll tell you a funny story about her as well. But bottom line was, Cruz and I made up and ended up, finishing the movie, and it all worked out well. Demi Moore was interesting. During most of the scenes, like her and her girlfriend, when they were doing their hair, they'd always be pointing over at me in this corner and laughing. And, I was on the set for like 28 days. And, finally I came over. I was like, am I doing something wrong? Because I noticed you guys, you keep laughing at me. And she was like, oh, I'm so sorry. We don't mean to laugh at you. It's just, you actually look like a Marine. I said, well, I actually am a Marine. And she was like, oh, well, that makes a lot of sense. And we end up talking. And as it turns out, her brother was actually on active duty in the Marine Corps while this movie was being filmed. So when she's talking about, they stand on this wall and they ensure that we don't get hurt and blah, 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 she's talking about her brother. And, this is a very heartfelt, emotional piece for her. So, and she was great. She was, very pleasant. We had Kiefer Sutherland was on the set, Kevin Bacon. It was a stud, a star-studded cast. And what was funny is I would go out in town afterwards, and I'd be out at a bar, and I'd be telling people like, yeah, I'm a Marine, a couple combat tours, but I'm just up here doing a movie with Jack Nicholson, Tom Cruise, Demi Moore, Kiefer Sutherland, Kevin Bacon, and everybody's like, all right, dude, stop with the lies. I'm like, I'm not lying. I'm telling you, like, what's the movie called? Well, it's called A Few Good Men. Like, well, I never heard of it. I said, well, it's not done yet. They're like, whatever. And so, yeah, it was funny because when this one young lady I'm telling this story to, she, at the end of the night, I tried getting her phone number, and she's like, yeah, I don't think so. In the future, just, don't try so hard. Don't make up all these stories. You're a decent enough guy. You don't have to make up these lies. I said, I'm not lying. And I told her a story about how Cruz and I had this fight. And she's like, yeah, that was a little over the top. And so I actually gave her phone number to her girlfriend and say, hey, look, try and get her to call me. And she's like, I don't think it's going to happen. Well, 2 weeks later, she actually did call me. And the reason she did is because that whole story about me and Cruz was actually written up in a Los Angeles magazine, and about how Cruz, made disparaging comments about an actual U.S. Marine. And she's like, so you weren't lying? I said, no. And so I actually have to thank Tom Cruise, because of him, I end up getting a date with this young lady, and we dated for 5 years thanks to him. So thanks, Tom.
Well, what the irony of it too is then a few years later, you actually got orders to go work in Guantanamo Bay. Well, I think we lost David. I think he's going to join us again. But folks, we've had a great time talking with David Gurfein, who is the CEO of United American Patriots, and he has just explained so much detail about the cases that have been adjudicated or the service members who have been pardoned, and we really, really learned a lot, and so we appreciate it. So you can catch this on YouTube. We'll put the show notes down below in the links. So if you want to learn more about UAP, go to uap.org. Okay, everyone. Well, we appreciate you joining us, and we'll have more conversations that matter with people you just can't forget. So thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.